to That's all I needed. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. So today, the talk is going to be delivered by Jaroslaw Lelonkiewicz. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay.
Yeah.
Who is an experimental psychologist currently based at the University of Pompeu, Fabra. He currently has a Marie Curie fellowship and also a Ramon, so you can be sure about his research quality. He's a specialist in language learning and memory, and in particular on how all these faculties achieve complex cognitive feats such as conceptual word meaning alignment. His PhD was in Edinburgh, which is nice because I had a very lovely years working there, so we kind of share that background. But he's been teaching and researching in some other universities like Napier, also in Edinburgh, which I actually lived quite close to Napier. And one in Italy that I can't remember the name because it was all Italian
and very long as well.
Exactly, so I'd rather not make a fool of myself. And some other universities like Brussels and whatnot, right? Yeah. So in any case, I think I'll just leave the floor to you. Please join me into welcoming Jaroslaw today.
So hi, everybody. Thank you very much for organizing this talk. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk to you. I'm hoping that I will be able to deliver a little bit of a different, interesting perspective for you today. So my name is Jaroslaw Lelonkiewicz. As Javier said, I am now based in Pompeu, Fabra. My Marie Curie is focusing on memory. Before I worked in Edinburgh on language use, afterwards in Italy, on language learning. So in my work, I'm kind of moving between language learning and memory, which I think is quite natural because this is what our cognitive system does. It's composed of many components which come together to give us the abilities that we have as individuals. The title of my talk is In Our Own Image, What Can the Science of the Human Mind Reveal About GenAI? The main message of my talk is that I think there's a great potential for a research program that merges cognitive science and machine learning. And by doing so, it helps both fields to address some issues which are topical and with which we are currently struggling. I will be keeping most of my talk broad, because I don't want to bog you down with some psychological technical details. Also, I'm doing that so you can see that this sort of program can be very powerful and can be easily applied to different sort of issues, for example, in machine learning. However, if you think that something I'm saying is interesting, or maybe it needs further clarification, or maybe you would like to get an example, please feel free to stop me in the talk or ask me after the talk. I will gladly do so. I'm preparing a theoretical review paper about these things. I submitted an ERC proposal this year, so I might be able to provide the detail that you might want. Right, so the structure of the talk for today, first I will start talking about the challenge in machine learning to create agentic AI. Then I will move on to discuss similarities and differences between the human mind and the current generation of AI. And then I will move on to talk about the kind of research program that we can have, first looking at the direction moving from cognitive science to contribute to machine learning, and then the opposite direction, looking how machine learning can contribute to cognitive scientific research. And finally, there will be a summary and a wrap-up. So here are some definitions of artificial intelligence in a good academic fashion. I'm starting with some definitions. So the great John McCarthy, for example, defined the ultimate effort of AI as to make computer programs that can solve problems and achieve goals in the world, as well as humans. Some key players in the industry right now, like Google, seem to have a similar vision. Google, for example, says AI is concerned with building computers and machines that can reason, learn, and act in such a way that would normally require human intelligence. IBM says AI enables computers and machines to simulate human learning, comprehension, problem-solving, decision-making, creativity, and autonomy. In machine learning in recent years, quite a lot of progress has been made to meet these very ambitious goals. Specifically, recent GenAI models are able to match, sometimes even surpass, human performance on a range of cognitive tasks. Models such like LLMs, for example, tend to do quite good. This is a quite famous figure from one technical paper by OpenAI. This shows all kinds of different exams, many of them university entry exams used to assess human performance, and the bars are just showing the percentage score that different versions of GPT achieved. And you can see that, for example, the green bars are the GPT-4 in this paper. You can see that GPT-4 tends to pass or even excel at many of this of these exams. So what it means is that the current GenAI models are very good at dealing with the acquisition and recall of factual knowledge. And this is very impressive, and it's a great feat of this field. However, the representation of knowledge is not an entirely solved issue in machine learning, right? And beyond that, dealing with factual knowledge is not the only or not the most important thing that the cognitive system can do. So intelligent behavior, according to the definitions I showed before, involves further components such as reasoning, problem solving, decision making, and acting. And because of this, or in addition to this, it is proactive, and it's linked to the environment. Therefore, intelligent behavior requires agency. A simple definition of agency, I took it from the book by Russell and Nordvig, says that an agent is anything that can be viewed as perceiving its environment through sensors and acting upon the same environment through actuators. For humans, acting upon our environment or our ecological niche is believed to be one of the major factors that propelled us through evolution. And the same kind of intuition, but this time with regards to AI, is again shared by the technology giants. So Google, in recent manifestos, says that the future of AI is agentic. Anthropic seems to be saying something similar, but calling it augmented AI. Now, the idea is that now that we have new GenAI models that are very successful learners, it is time to move them forward, to convert them into more autonomous, more complex AI agents that can act within the real world and interact with human partners. This is a great goal, but this is also where complexity enters the picture. Already looking at the definition, the simple definition of Russell and Nordvig, we can see that being an agent involves the cognitive act of perceiving, another act of acting upon the perception. And in addition, it implies dedicated cognitive systems, such as perception and the action system, or sensors and actuators. And this doesn't really end there. The closer we look at what agency requires, the more components we see are currently missing from the GenAI architectures. This is a framework, again, proposed by Google. It's called React. And according to this framework, an AI agent should be able to observe and gather information about the environment, should be able to reason using this information, which means drawing conclusions, solving problems, should be able to plan its actions based on the outcomes it wants to achieve, then of course it should be able to act using those plans, the decisions it has made, and any external input that is coming in. Further, an agent should be capable of collaborating with other machine agents or humans. And this, in cognitive science, we know, is a complex skill that requires even more cognitive components so that we are able to achieve it. So to collaborate, an AI agent needs to be able to communicate, needs to be able to coordinate with other agents, and it needs to have the ability to understand and adapt to the perspective of others, which in psychology, for example, is called theory of mind. Finally, last but not least, another very ambitious goal for agentic AI is to make these type of models self-refining, which means that they can learn from their current experience and from any feedback that they receive along the way as they act. So the problem is that, as you probably already know, the current GenAI models, at least the bare bone models, do not have most of these abilities. So the idea is that we could implement these bare bone models into larger agentic systems that would be able to have some of these cognitive capacities. Right. This brings me to a comparison between the Gen AI models and the human brain. Although the new generation of models can achieve some very impressive things, especially, as I said, with regards to learning and operating on knowledge, if we compare the architecture and the abilities of those models to the human, in my opinion, it's still quite an uneven comparison. The architecture of the Gen AI models seem to be rather simplistic compared to the human brain. So we can look at this functional map of the human brain, for example. And this map, by the way, shows only the cortex, so the outer layer of the brain, not to mention everything else that is in there. And even a quick look on this map will show us that the brain seems to be much more complicated than the current AI models. So in what follows, I'm going to try to be fair to the AI models, and I'm not going to focus on aspects of cognition that the models obviously currently do not have, like motor action or sensation, or the parts of the system that are responsible for perceiving and operating on the body, right? Obviously, AI agents or the bare bone models, they don't have any of that. However, as we know, they have the learning system, they're able to learn, and they can memorize stuff. So these are the learning and memory systems which are already implemented in the models. Humans have them obviously as well. So in the comparison of the human mind and the Gen AI models, I will focus on these faculties. This table summarizes some similarities and differences between the learning in humans and Gen AI. So in terms of architecture, one word to describe the architecture of Gen AI, according to what I have seen in the literature, is that the learning architecture is static. It means that the learning tends to be in the bare bone models, of course, one-off, and then it tends to follow the same mechanisms throughout the process. In contrast to that, humans learn dynamically, which means that we learn throughout the developmental lifespan, continuously from experience, and flexibly selecting different learning mechanisms as we go. This also means that learning is applied developmentally or gradually, if you like. So for example, very little babies, neonatals, they will be relying more on some sort of more passive learning mechanisms like statistical learning, for instance, whereas adults probably will not. They will be able to engaged in different sort of learning. Talking about the mechanisms themselves, in GenAI, the main mechanisms seem to be passive learning, largely statistical learning, so extraction of regularities and patterns from the data set, whereas humans also learn passively, but have active learning mechanisms, which means a lot of human learning is driven by the demands of the current task, and sometimes just by pure curiosity. With regard to modalities, it's fine. GenAI can learn knowledge which comes from obviously the language modality, now also visual and I think auditory. Humans can do all that, but also they have the proprioceptive modality, which is sensations from the body, and the spatial representation of knowledge. As for learning settings, in GenAI, the setting is mostly passive exposure to the data set, then followed, as we know, by some feedback-based learning from humans or other models. Human learners also do exposure and feedback learning, but on top of that, as I said, they learn from experience. And we, as a species, also developed the context of teaching, which is a quite interesting form of learning, which is interactive, and it implies a kind of continuous negotiation of both the content and the process of learning between the agent that is the learner and the agent that is a teacher. We use teaching to do a lot of our learning, which I think testifies to how powerful it is, and it's currently, well, likely missing in how we train GenAI. The overall goals of learning in GenAI, I think the main goal would be prediction or error minimization, if you like. And then in humans, there is prediction-driven learning, but on top of that also, especially now, the field is moving to say that a lot of learning is focused on detecting novelty. There is a lot of evidence, for example, from neuroscientific studies showing that the brain reacts with a spike in attention or activation when it perceives a stimulus that is an oddball, which means something unexpected, something that is different from the currently perceived regularity in the environment. And this sort of evidence and other is used to now advance our learning theory to say that a lot of human learning probably is actually focused on detecting changes, novelty in the environment rather than the regularities. Briefly about the faculty of memory, GenAI architecture of memory is pretty much long-term memory storage, semantic long-term memory. Humans have semantic long-term memory. I'm able to use words as I speak to you, but we also have procedural and episodic type of long-term memory. Episodic memory, for example, is a memory that concerns my own personal autobiographic events from my life. And interestingly, it seems that humans represent or store this sort of memories and information differently from semantic information. Modalities of knowledge representation or memory. As far as I understood, GenAI appears to have single type of modality. So everything is a vector. Correct me if I'm wrong. But be it single or not, humans surely have more. So humans also have visual, auditory, proprioceptive, and spatial modality of knowledge representation. If, as cognitive scientists, we are trying to probe what information is stored in human memory, we will find evidence pointing to the fact that these different modalities of information are somehow represented differently, separately. Okay, and a little bit more on the knowledge representation in the memory system. GenAI is representing everything abstractly as numeric vectors. The vectors are polysemic, so they capture different semantic meanings, and the representation is contextual. This is a great achievement of machine learning recently, and as far as we know, humans seem to represent knowledge in the same way. So here there is a lot of convergence. Right. So what comes out of this comparison is that a lot of what GenAI models are doing is pretty much following the principles of human learning and memory. The main difference being the human system being basically more complicated, having more components. The whole point of making such comparisons is to be able to identify areas which could be further developed in machine learning using what we know about human intelligence. So this is where my proposal for the research program enters, to use cognitive science for machine learning. The program is translational and experimental. It's a research program using cognitive scientific methods and theory to advance machine learning. It's translational because I'm suggesting to take the theory from different cognitive sciences and then find applications in machine learning engineering. It's experimental because I'm also visualizing how this could be done using experimental methods. The main motivation for this program is that the development of GenAI agents could benefit from modeling these agents on at least some aspects of human cognition. And there are at least 3 reasons why this is a good idea. First, human intelligence is the most sophisticated and successful type of intelligence that we currently know. Maybe there are other types of intelligence that are even better, but for all we know, humans right now seems to be pretty good. Then the purpose of GenAI agents would be to solve human-made tasks, which are immersed in how humans think and in our social reality. And the third main reason is that the purpose of GenAI would be to interact and cooperate with humans. So for all these reasons, I argued that it would make sense to make GenAI agents a little bit more similar to humans. A critic could say that we don't have to do that. That in principle, it's possible to develop intelligence completely from scratch, right? And this is probably true. We could develop a completely new alien intelligence that later would figure out humans and solve the problem of interacting with us. But the least I could say, well, actually, I could say 2 things. One thing is that it's uncertain whether this sort of alien intelligence would naturally follow the same values that we have. So in short, maybe it wouldn't be that interested to cooperate with us, actually. And second and most important argument is that it seems to be an unnecessarily long and complicated route to intelligence, coming up with everything from the scratch, where we have evolutionary tested solutions in the human mind. So this sentiment is shared by some of the people in the machine learning community. In the quote from McCarthy, he says, the goal of AI is to achieve goals in the world as well as humans. Google says to learn, act in such a way that would require human intelligence. IBM says to simulate human learning, comprehension, and so on. If you look at the writings of Alan Turing or Geoffrey Hinton, these giants of machine learning, artificial intelligence, they were also pointing to the idea that it probably is very useful to model artificial intelligence, at least on some aspects of human cognition. In the program, I see 2 main research directions. One is to look at individual cognition, and then we can split it or apply it to improvements in the learning architecture of GenAI, or improvements to the agentic systems where the bare-bone models are applied in the system. The particular topics in this direction would be to, for example, try to improve semantic knowledge representation to make it more human-like. You have people like Evelina Fedorenko and colleagues from MIT who currently are trying to change the learning architecture so the knowledge is acquired and stored, the semantic knowledge, in a way that is more similar to what human language speakers do. You could also try to develop a new or a different, more realistic learning process. So in the training of GenAI, we could try to apply some principles of how human children learn. which could, for example, mean structuring the data sets or pacing learning, starting with easier problems, moving on to more complicated problems. There's a lot of possible advantages to this. I probably shouldn't be getting into the details, so I will not, but I'm happy to get into the details later. So there are possible advantages of how making, for example, the learning training process more developmentally plausible, how this could help to possibly solve some problems in machine learning, such as catastrophic forgetting, maybe. And another kind of interesting topic here, this direction, is to try to implement modular human-like memory in the agentic systems. I can cite, for example, the work of my colleague, Martin Grutendorst. And this could look something like that. This is just an example, which I hope is making it clear how implicating a modular system of memory in the agentic GenAI could make it more efficient and successful. So here you see that the agent is presented with some task. What is the average stock price of NVIDIA? Then it is using some tools to find the solution to this task, and produces an answer. However, if it doesn't have long-term memory, if the user approaches this agent again and probes its memory or asks it to say, what tools did you use after a certain amount of time, the agent will have no idea. Not only it's making the interaction with the user potentially awkward, more importantly, perhaps, it means that the agent has no recollection of the tool selection that it already has done, right? Now, if we imagine a reality where these agents don't just have a list of tools, but are able to creatively find new tools, so finding an applicable tool is part of solving the task. In this reality, having memory is a very important prerequisite, right? Because if the agent already solved the task, found a tool that allowed it to solve the task, if it has memory, next time it doesn't have to look for the tool all over again. It can be quicker, right? And know which tools can be applied to solve a particular problem. One further interesting consequence of having memory for the tool use of agentic AI is that it potentially could allow for using the tools by analogy, right? So if the agent has learned that a given tool can be used to solve problem A, if later it is faced with problem B, which is quite different, but maybe has the same desired outcome, to use tools by analogy is to use the same tool to achieve a solution of a slightly different task with a similar outcome. To give you an illustration from human reality, I, for example, might want to open a can, but I don't have a can opener. But I know that kind of the desired outcome of opening a can is to cut a piece of tin. If I don't have the opener, by analogy, I can figure out that I can use a knife, right? It seems completely obvious when I say this, but this is not a trivial cognitive feat. And in fact, anthropologists make a big argument about this, saying that humans are the only animals that can do this sort of stuff. And this is a very important achievement in our evolutionary path that later allowed us to do so much more. Okay, so moving on from this example, second direction in this research program is to look at joint cognition. So what mechanisms humans have to achieve joint cognition. This would mostly focus on implementations in the agentic systems. The topics could be, for example, looking at the mechanisms allowing the models, or humans and then the models, to align on the world model, which, for example, could include identifying and aligning on the goals of the human partner or another AI partner. Further things could be explored here and implemented in agentic systems, group cooperation mechanisms. This is because humans have dedicated mechanisms of joint cognition that help us to be particularly good and quick at cooperating with others. There's another kind of layer of complexity to this. We know that multi-user, multi-agent interactions can be considered as dynamic systems, and then you can analyze those systems in terms of certain principles like synchronization, for example. So there's also a lot of this stuff happening, which could potentially be implemented in agentic AI. Okay, this is taken from the work of Martin Grutendorst. This is just a figure which is trying to show that the direction of making the Gen AI agents more complicated according to some of the cognitive human mechanisms is already happening. So this is showing a schematic agent architecture of a large language model in this case, which has been given some sort of memory bank. Martin here proposed that this could be, for example, short-term, long-term memory, and some retrieval mechanisms. This model has been giving the ability to use tools, to search for tools, call functions and whatnot. Then also it's been given some sort of extended planning abilities. The recent directions, as far as I understand, include chain of thought reasoning, reflection, goal decomposition, right? So this is already happening. We have people around the world trying to implement the little solutions like this into agentic AI. What my program is on top of that adding is that here, where there is a contact point between the agentic AI and another agent, human or machine, here there are also the interaction mechanisms that come from joint cognition that can be implemented in the agentic architecture in the system. Okay, so I'm doing quite well. Now I would like to move to the other side of the program, or the other really side of the other consequence of running this sort of program. So far I discussed that by applying the advances from cognitive science, we can make progress in machine learning, especially in the issue of creating agentic AI. But running this sort of research also promises benefits for cognitive science. And this is what I will briefly focus on right now. I have a different version of this talk, which I gave to my colleagues in cognitive science. And I obviously focus more on this part, but I think it's maybe not that exciting for you. So the argument here is that Gen AI models, such as large language models, should be involved in cognitive scientific research. First of all, because if we do that, we will start to understand better how similar these models are to humans. Second, modeling Gen AI on humans and then exploring that these modeled Gen AI agents are human-like would lead us to a situation where we have good human-like models of cognition, which would basically be the Gen AI agents. And then these human-like models could be used the same way as we use other scientific models for investigation. So cognitive science has a long history of using, for example, animal models. So we have animals, they are not quite like humans, but they're a little bit like humans in some domain. Maybe rats have great vision, or maybe they find their way spatially. Similarly to humans, we can experiment with them to learn something about the human mind. Once we reach the point of having human-like Gen AI, we could use these AI models similarly to animal models to ask questions about human intelligence. Right. The final step in any sort of cognitive scientific investigation, including these Gen AI models, would be to take the conclusions of our research, whatever this would be, and then try to apply it back to humans to run basically replication experiment with human participants. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. Advantages of this program, practical advantages for cognitive science is greater speed, quantity, and better cost to ratio of data collection. This obviously means facilitation of the research process. Everything gets much quicker. Methodologically, there are some interesting advantages. We could get some new methods to be used in cognitive science. And this is because, as you know, in GenAI, in particular in LLMs, there's a whole list of tools that are now used mostly in machine learning for the purpose of AI explainability, but they could well be used in cognitive science for the purpose of understanding the cognitive structure of these models and therefore possibly the cognitive structure of humans. I have a list of these tools. However, I'm just going to highlight some of them because, again, this is maybe more interesting to my colleagues in cognitive science. One interesting kind of way of thinking about using GenAI for cognitive science is to use these models as subjects in experimentation instead of humans. And if we do so, then we get access to these methods. So, for example, there is a method we begin now to call machine introspection. This is essentially asking the model for justification of its behavior. And it's quite interesting. I actually ran a study where I gave a classic psychological task to a language model and then asked it to justify each of its decisions in this task. Through this, I found out that the model reported it was using some interesting criterion to make the decision. I then analyzed the actual behavioral data from the model and saw that it was true. As it reported, it was using this criterion. And then I went on to run this experiment with humans and tested if humans too use this criterion, and they do too. So that's an example of how you can start with a model, look at what it reports in its introspection of how it's solving a particular task, and then move it to human research to learn something about how humans solve stuff. Just to highlight another interesting method, embedding extraction is something I particularly like because it gives us interesting possibility to access semantic representation of the model, which is something we definitely cannot do with humans. So that's very attractive to cognitive scientists. And the kind of stuff you could do with this, to just give you one idea, is that you could, for example, see how an AI agent interacting with, let's say, a human is continuously aligning or adapting its semantic representation to the human agent. This is what happens in humans. If we're talking, we're negotiating meanings, and then we tend to arrive on this similar kind of world model representation of the situation. This, in turn, allows us to cooperate better and makes us more successful at solving joint tasks. So hopefully you can see that this direction would be also interesting for AI, right? So if we examine by extracting embeddings from the model at different points of the interaction with the human, if we examine that the model is successfully adapting to the human, and maybe we can be a little bit more clever about this and see how it's doing that by some experimental manipulation, then this gives us a great insight into something that is a very powerful mechanism of coordination and joint task solving, both in humans and in AI agents, potentially. Okay, just maybe one more. You could use GenAI as synthetic participants. So as you know, we can try to have a specialist model. We retrain it on some particular data set. So we have, let's say we take a mature generic llama or something like that, and then we fine tune it on a particular data set, maybe coming from an interesting clinical population, right? Which would mean we get a final product of a model which is imitating a particular type of human. If we then experiment with this model, this can give us really an upper hand in our clinical investigation in something like psychology, for example. Right, so not to bore you too much, I'm going to wrap up and move on to the summary. So what I'm proposing is this research program merging cognitive science and machine learning for hopefully the benefit of both. I see it actually as a very interesting opportunity right now in our fields, both of them. So the first direction I discussed, the first side of the project, is to use cognitive science for machine learning, where we can use knowledge about human, individual, and joint cognition in order to design efficient, human-compatible GenAI agents. This leg of this program really easily gives itself to creating studies and attacking particular issues that we would be interested in solving. The type of very general experimental paradigm that you could use in this is that you have an AI agent interacting with a human agent. You take the measurement of performance of some benchmark in this kind of basic setting, and then you manipulate, you modify the agent, for example, by adding some cooperation mechanisms or some individual cognition mechanisms from memory or learning. And then you again collect the measurement on the benchmark and basically see if these changes improve the performance in the interactive task with the human. So that's the overall logic. And you can basically insert most of the topics that now relate to the issue of making these agents better at cooperating with humans. The other side of the program is to use machine agents to push boundaries of what we can do in the investigation in cognitive science. For example, as I said, you can think about using a GenAI agent, and maybe this enriched one that we just created in some of our paradigms. You could use these agents and then apply some of the tools that I described, like embedding extraction, to investigate a particular question you are interested in about human psychology. Just final 3 slides. So why is it the right time to do this sort of research? In short, it's because this technology has progressed so much and it's more accessible than ever before. There's a lot of incentive across commercial, political, academic sector to try to do this sort of hybrid research. So yeah, as I said, the GenAI reached this sort of maturity that makes it kind of ready to be implemented as agents. We have the whole generation of open models, at least right now, like the Llama model, for example, that can be easily used or applied in the academic research process. I know for you guys it's probably not a problem, but in the academia, you know, with our small kind of computers, if you want to ever collaborate with any academic partners, you need to think about costs and things like this. So this is a big advantage for the academia side. There's a booming community in GenAI. A lot of people are developing agents, right? Trying out those different ideas, how to improve memory and whatnot. So this program could kind of join in, maybe start collaborating with some of the groups that are already trying to implement some solutions. On the other side of cognitive science, there's also a great interest right now amongst cognitive scientists into in AI. So people are really impressed by what the current models can do, and there's a lot of discussion right now, and I think a lot of papers coming out. So a pretty good moment. Then, of course, gigantic public and private investment to do this sort of research. Okay, why use machine learning for cognitive science? Because we can get in cognitive science new tools to do our investigation. This is well, I'm kind of trying to argue for it a little bit more because there are some people who are very skeptical about this idea. But for me, using extra additional tools from machine learning only makes sense. And you can think about this as physics, solving the problems about reality, looking at the level of particular particles, maybe in colliders, and then looking at the level of stars, astrophysics, right? So you have completely different tools that are looking at reality from different angles to achieve the same sort of progress. That's my key argument for getting more tools into cognitive science, which in turn would help us attack the grand questions about intelligence. to give some interesting ideas. For example, one is called symbolic grounding, which means, okay, language is symbolic, but the symbols refer to something. And we tend to think in cognitive science that they're grounded in our senses and our experience perception of reality. Now, GenAI right now doesn't really have that. Can it be intelligent? Maybe it can. Then what is intelligence? Does it require symbolic grounding consensus? Maybe not, right? So this is a very interesting, broad question probing into the nature of intelligence itself. And last thing, why to use cognitive science for machine learning? So the key message here would be that cognitive science can provide us with scientific knowledge about cognitive mechanisms, solutions on how to have agents that are successful in the world. And these solutions have been thoroughly tested throughout hundreds of years of evolution of the species and social structures. So perhaps these are some good solutions that could be implemented in our efforts to create AI agents. This could be an alternative or additional route to just scaling up computing and data sets. There is maybe a little bit more interest in looking for alternatives to scaling, because as we know, with mass implementation of some of the GenAI models, we begin to see some limitations to just throwing in more compute onto things. So I don't know, things like GPT or whatnot, they have just usage limits, right? Because so many users wants to implement them, and this trend will surely continue. So there is maybe a realistic practical question of like how much energy and resources we can have to have this technology. Maybe it's worth looking for solutions that do not make improvement through more resources, maybe through improving efficiency instead. Applying cognitive science to machine learning can help us with the goal of AI explainability, because if we create models that are kind of in our image that follow principles of human cognition, we know what principles they follow, which helps us understand the process, what mechanisms, process of solving tasks by the agents, what mechanisms they use to solve tasks, and the architecture of those agents themselves. Anthropic is interested in that, for instance. Now, another interesting, maybe two more interesting things, having Gen AI modeled on humans can be conducive to the goal of creating AI or AI agents that are ethically aligned with us and therefore potentially more secure. So the argument here is that human values most likely didn't just materialize out of nothing. They are a result of the evolution of our individual cognitive system and of our social systems. Again, making models similar to humans so that they follow the principles of individual and joint cognition should make it more natural, easier for them to align with our goals, with our values. Again, an alternative to what seems to be often done in machine learning right now, which is hard coding stuff, say this, don't say this, and so on. One final point, the program merging cognitive science with machine learning could help us prepare for the future of this technology. There is a whole lot of very interesting things that are already kind of happening, might happen very soon. So the idea of human in the loop, so having some sort of very rich systems involving AI agents and human agents. This touches on research that we've been doing for a while in cognitive science, which is into human extended cognition. A human agent interacting with an AI agent would be a sort of an extended cognition system. And we already have some knowledge about how these systems can work, can be designed in cognitive science. Another future possibility for the technology of Gen AI is one of machine culture. So this is maybe an interesting take on the issue of using increasing amounts of AI-produced data for AI training. right? The usual worry we have is that if we continue doing so, then maybe the AI models trained on AI data, they will not be very good for some reason. You can think differently about that and see that this is essentially how cultures are made, right? So as humans interact with other humans in their group, they tend to reinforce themselves with the same kind of information they produce for themselves, which kind of pushes a whole snowball of culture development until we have a particular social group that has a behavior, or maybe a nation or whatnot. So this is a direction where the machines could go easily. Again, cognitive science with a lot of focus on anthropology, culture, and human interactions could be potentially good, and arm us with the ability to work with this new reality of machine culture that might happen in the future. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. As I said, if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Jaroslav, for that. That's a quite interesting and bold take, given that there's a lot of people here that believe in the power of mathematics, logics, and all that, and then you come here with your cognitive science. Let's see what they have to say. Julia, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you for the talk. It was very, very interesting. I love talking about the relationship, like the comparison between human brain and the AI. I have a question about the point you made on using LLMs using LLMs as models of language use specifically, because I have very limited experience with it, like a model of how some morphological process happens. As far as I know, these are very limited models, you know, like you build them based on a very specific capability in a specific population, and you use it for a specific experiment, and you extract specific conclusions from it that are not generalizable to the human brain. But I find that is very different from the hype that LLMs get, because they are just so good at what they do that a lot of people understand them as like, and I'm not saying this is correct. I mean, a lot of people misunderstand them as this is how human language works. So now there's people saying like, oh, so humans have generative syntax because this LLM has been shown to act like it has generative grammar, generative syntax. And I just want to ask you a little bit if you've thought about how using LLMs for this would be different from using very specific models, just because I find that there's a very big risk of acting like we know that that's how human language works when we don't. There is no confirmation that human language works in the brain the same way as LLMs statistically learn how to reproduce it. So I was just wondering a little bit about the risk of this kind of usage and the care we have to take in reporting results from experiments that were done with LLMs, not with humans.
Yeah, sure. Right.
Just give me a second. Could you at home hear the question?
I'm not going to repeat it. That was very long.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Great. Okay. So there are different positions, mostly in linguistics. Linguists are interested in this sort of question. Language seems to be indeed a little bit, well, it's a kind of an easy aspect of cognition, because you can analyze it, because these models are mostly trained on language, so they are kind of good at dealing with language. On the other hand, language is something different than other cognitive faculties, it seems. So maybe it's a special case. And then you have two main camps. One is Chomsky, for example, saying language is key aspects of language are innate, and these models cannot have them. Also, if you analyze some toy examples that Chomsky really likes, these models fail at producing the same behavior as humans. This is some sort of syntactic structures that they're not good at generating. The other camp is, for example, my colleague Marco Baroni, who spoke here some time ago, I heard. These sort of linguists are computational linguists. They think, okay, this is LLMs, just like all our models, are not perfect models, but they are models of some parts of the linguistic faculty. So maybe they fail at syntax or some sort of syntax, but they don't fail at something else. So we can use what we see is convergent with humans and focus on exploring this and go from that. Short answer, this is a field of research and it should be treated as such. So using LLMs, so I believe that we should be using LLMs or other GenAI models because this allows us to understand the situation better and start to gather evidence about how similar these models are or how different they are, right? So that's my kind of short answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers. Cedric online has had their hand up for a while. I'm quite scared because I've seen 4 questions in the chat. So Cedric, if you could keep it short because we're almost on time, we would appreciate it.
I will keep it very short. Thank you very much, Jaroslav, for your talk. I want to respond to one of the earlier points you made. Curiosity-driven learning, as you put it, can actually be programmed in reinforced learning, and we practice that. It can also be conditioned, learning can also be conditioned on what's being learned by machine algorithm. So that's one of the things I wanted to comment on. The second one is that multimodal learning is a real thing. It exists. We practice it, some of us on a daily basis, and we can learn simultaneously from many, many different types of inputs. The third, yes?
Sorry, so you mean, so this is the point I wasn't sure about, which is in what
Yes.
what modalities are represented, right? Is everything a mathematical vector or somehow a visual modality will be represented separately, differently from language modality? Is this what you is what you're saying that there are in fact different sort of modalities represented?
Out there's a zoo. You have different types of multimodal learning methodologies.
All right.
The richer or the one that carries the wealthiest, the one that is more interesting is the one where all the vectorization process is common to all the modes of learning, to all the types of inputs, be them photos, videos, which are basically a sequence of frames, audio, text, could be pretty much anything. Also graphs, such as mathematical graphs. When those inputs can be, and they can be vectorized or embedded in the same vector space, so they have a commonality of representation. And in this case, we talk about strongly coupled multimodal learning. And the model that results from this is capable of do cross-modal inferences. So you may ask it a question about with text or audio, speech, and it may answer to you with a made-up picture or a picture that it will have retrieved, or it may answer to you with a graph, or with code, or with something. Text to speech, even audio, it's capable of producing audio. The third point I want to make is that agentic AI would be perfectly capable, and in some cases is capable of recalling provenance of information, but you have to program this into its capabilities, into its functionality. And the last thing, and I'm finished, is that GenAI, we kind of differentiate between what you seem to call long-term memory and reasoning. I know that you talked about both. Reasoning would, in your example of the agentic AI opening a tin can, it would consist in the agent being able to retrieve information about tools at its disposal, about their function, and about causal template. Some causal templating involving the tool and the function. And when presented with the task of opening a tin can, then your agent would be able to produce a one-shot inference, meaning without the benefit of prior experience, it would be able to produce a decision on how to best open a tin can. So that's a thing. It exists, but that's what we call reasoning. It's not based on memory. It's based on reasoning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are interesting points. I'll make sure to look more closely into them. For example, with regards to reasoning, I didn't think that, or implementation of memory, I didn't want to claim that nothing is being implemented, that there are no capacities in this sense. But I think this is something that, well, my understanding so far is that these are not solved problems yet, or not entirely. But in any case, I will be looking closely at what you just said, because I think these are very interesting comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I know we're over time, so and everyone is hungry here. So again, any questions that you might have, because there's a lot of things to talk, and good thing that we're having lunch together.
Yeah.
Feel free to reach out to Jaroslav via email, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Hola.
Sorry, very, very random question.
Yeah.
Hola.